Story 1. I'd always loved the idea of living in San Diego. The sun, the beach, the vibrant city life. It was everything I had dreamed of. When I finally got the opportunity to move there for a new job as a graphic designer, I jumped at the chance. I found a charming little house in a quiet suburban neighborhood, perfect for starting a new chapter in my life. The neighborhood was picturesque, with well-manicured lawns and friendly neighbors who waved as they walked by. My house was a cozy 2-bedroom with a small garden in the back. It was everything I wanted. On my first day, as I unpacked boxes and set up my new home, I felt a sense of peace and excitement. This was my fresh start. My neighbor, Mr. Thompson, was the first to introduce himself. He was an elderly man, probably in his 70s, with a warm smile and a gentle demeanor. He lived alone in the house next to mine, a quaint little place with a beautiful garden full of flowers. "Welcome to the neighborhood," he said, handing me a plate of freshly baked cookies. "I'm Mr. Thompson, but you can call me George." "Thank you, George," I replied, smiling. "I'm Lisa, it's nice to meet you." We chatted for a bit, and he told me about the neighborhood and some of the other residents. He seemed friendly and harmless, just a lonely old man looking for some company. I didn't think much of it at the time. As the days passed, I settled into my new routine. I loved my job and my coworkers were friendly. I spent my evenings exploring the city and weekends relaxing at home or visiting the beach. Life was good, but then little things started to happen. At first, they were easy to dismiss. I would come home and find my mailbox open or the gate to my garden slightly ajar. I chalked it up to my forgetfulness or perhaps the wind. But soon I began to notice something else. Mr. Thompson was always watching. At first I thought it was just my imagination. After all, George was retired and spent most of his time at home. It wasn't unusual for him to be in his garden or sitting on his porch, but I couldn't shake the feeling that his eyes were always on me. Every time I looked out my window, there he was, either watering his plants, reading a book, or just sitting there watching. He would wave and smile whenever I caught his eye. But there was something unsettling about it. I started to feel paranoid, always looking over my shoulder, always aware of his presence. One evening, as I was taking out the trash, I noticed George standing at his window peering out at me. The light from inside cast a shadow over his face, making his features hard to discern. I waved awkwardly and he waved back, but instead of moving away from the window, he just stood there watching. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that he was just a lonely old man, but the unease grew. One night I heard footsteps outside my window. I rushed to look but saw nothing. The garden gate was open again and I could have sworn I had closed it. The next morning I found a small gift on my porch, a potted plant with a note that read, "Welcome to the neighborhood." There was no name, but I knew it was from George. I appreciated the gesture but couldn't shake the feeling that it was another way for him to keep tabs on me. As weeks turned into months, George's behavior became more unsettling. He started showing up at my door unannounced, offering to help with odd jobs around the house or bringing me more baked goods. I tried to be polite but firm, declining his offers and keeping our interactions brief. One night I invited some friends over for a small dinner party. It was a fun evening filled with laughter and good food. As we sat in the living room, I glanced out the window and saw George standing in his yard staring at us. He wasn't even trying to hide it. My friends noticed too, and the mood shifted. "Who's the creepy neighbor?" my friend Jenna asked, her eyes wide. "That's George," I said with a forced smile. "He's just a bit odd." "He's more than odd," another friend Mike said. "He's staring right at us." I decided to close the blinds, blocking out George's unsettling gaze. The rest of the evening went smoothly, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next day, George knocked on my door. When I opened it, he stood there with a frown. "I noticed you had some friends over last night," he said. "I hope I didn't disturb you." "Not at all," I lied. "We were just having a small get-together." He nodded, but his eyes held a strange intensity. "If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to ask." "Thank you, George," I said, closing the door as quickly as I could. That night, I installed security cameras around my property. I needed to know if my fears were real or just a product of my imagination. The security cameras provided some peace of mind, but also confirmed my worst fears. Reviewing the footage, I saw George frequently lurking around my house, sometimes late at night. He would stand in my yard, looking towards my windows and occasionally try the garden gate. It was clear that his friendly facade was hiding something much darker. I decided to confront him, but not without evidence. I collected the footage and documented every instance of his strange behavior. I needed to be prepared. One afternoon I saw George in his garden and decided it was time. I walked over, my heart pounding. "George, can I talk to you for a minute?" "Of course, Lisa," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I've noticed you've been around my house a lot lately," I began. "It's making me uncomfortable." His smile faltered. "I was just trying to be a good neighbor. I didn't mean to make you feel that way." "I appreciate your intentions, but it's too much," I said firmly. "I need you to give me some space." He nodded slowly, his expression hardening. I understand, I'll stay away. I hoped that would be the end of it, but the feeling of unease lingered. One day, while researching the history of my house at the local library, I stumbled upon old newspaper clippings about a missing person case from years ago. George's wife had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and the case had never been solved. My blood ran cold as I read through the articles. George had been the prime suspect, but there was no evidence to convict him. The community had eventually forgotten about it, but the details were chillingly similar to what I was experiencing. I dug deeper, finding more about George's life. He had been a quiet, unassuming man, but neighbors had noted his possessive and controlling behavior towards his wife. It all pointed to one conclusion: George was dangerous. Armed with this new information, I went to the police. I showed them the footage and shared my findings. They took my concerns seriously and agreed to investigate. Meanwhile, George's behavior became more erratic. He would stand outside my house for hours, glaring at my windows. One night, I heard someone trying to break in. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, the intruder was gone. However, the garden gate was open, and George was nowhere to be found. I was terrified. It was clear that George wasn't going to stop until he got what he wanted. One stormy night, as I was preparing for bed, I heard a loud crash from the living room. I grabbed my phone and the baseball bat I kept by my bed and crept downstairs. The front door was wide open and George was standing in the hallway, soaked from the rain, a wild look in his eyes. "George, get out," I shouted, holding the bat defensively. He took a step forward, a twisted smile on his face. "You don't understand, Lisa, I need you." I backed away, dialing 911. "Stay away from me, George, the police are on their way." He lunged at me and I swung the bat, hitting him on the shoulder. He stumbled back, giving me enough time to run upstairs and lock myself in the bathroom. I could hear him pounding on the door, shouting my name. Minutes felt like hours until I heard sirens and the front door being kicked in. The police dragged George away, kicking and screaming. I collapsed in relief, tears streaming down my face. George was arrested and charged with breaking and entering, and further investigation linked him to his wife's disappearance. The evidence was overwhelming, and he was eventually convicted. The neighborhood breathed a collective sigh of relief. I moved out of the house a few weeks later, unable to stay in a place that held so many dark memories. I found a new home in a different part of the city, hoping to start fresh once again, but the experience had changed me. I was more cautious, always looking over my shoulder, always wary of who might be watching. The trauma of those months stayed with me, a constant reminder that sometimes the friendliest faces can hide the darkest secrets. Story 2. When my wife Julia and I bought the old Victorian house in Boston, we thought it was the perfect place to start our new life. As a history professor, Mark, was enamored with the rich history of the house and the neighborhood. Julia loved the charm and character of the old building, and we both looked forward to restoring it to its former glory. Our neighbor, Mr. Green, was a quiet man who kept to himself. He lived in a similar old house next door, but he was in a state of disrepair. Despite his reclusive nature, he seemed harmless enough. We would exchange polite nods when we saw him, but he never said much. Our first few weeks in the house were blissful. We spent our days renovating and our nights enjoying the cozy fireplace. But then we started hearing strange noises. It began with faint tapping sounds at night, coming from Mr. Green's house. At first, we dismissed it as the sounds of an old house settling, but the noises grew louder and more persistent. It sounded like someone was moving furniture or hammering something in the basement. Julia and I joked about Mr. Green being a nocturnal carpenter, but the truth was, we were starting to feel uneasy. One night, the noises were particularly loud. I decided to investigate. I walked over to Mr. Green's house and knocked on the door. After a long pause, he answered, looking disheveled and annoyed. "Sorry to bother you, Mr. Green," I said, "but we've been hearing some loud noises coming from your house at night. Is everything okay?" He stared at me for a moment before nodding. "Just some renovations," he muttered. "I'll try to keep it down." I thanked him and returned home, but the noises continued. As the noises persisted, Julia and I started to worry. We decided to do some research on the history of Mr. Green's house. We discovered that it had once belonged to a reclusive artist named Samuel Reed, who had vanished without a trace many years ago. The house had been sold several times since, with each owner moving out quickly. Intrigued, I dug deeper into the local archives and found old articles about Samuel Reed. He was known for his dark, surreal paintings, and his disappearance had been a mystery that captivated the community. Some speculated that he had gone mad, while others believed he had met with foul play. The more I read, the more I felt that there was something sinister about Mr. Green's house. Julia and I decided to investigate further. One evening, while Mr. Green was out, I convinced Julia to help me sneak into his basement. We felt guilty about trespassing, but our curiosity and concern outweighed our reservations. The basement was cluttered with old furniture and boxes, but in one corner we found something that made our blood run cold. There were bizarre sculptures and paintings, all in the style of Samuel Reed. They depicted twisted, nightmarish scenes that sent shivers down our spines. We also found a hidden room, accessed through a narrow door behind a stack of crates. Inside, we discovered more artwork and a journal that appeared to belong to Samuel Reed. The journal entries were filled with ramblings about dark forces and strange rituals. The final entry was particularly disturbing, describing how he felt he was being watched and controlled by an unseen entity. As we read through the journal, we heard the sound of footsteps above us. Mr. Green had returned. Panic set in, and we quickly but quietly made our way out of the basement, leaving everything as we had found it. Back at our house, we discussed our findings. It seemed clear that Mr. Green was somehow connected to Samuel Reed. But what was the nature of that connection? Was he a descendant or something more sinister? Determined to find out, we continued our research. We found a few more articles suggesting that Samuel Reed had been involved in occult practices. This discovery made us even more uneasy about Mr. Green. The situation escalated one night when we heard a scream coming from Mr. Green's house. Julia and I rushed outside and saw Mr. Green standing in his yard looking more deranged than ever. "Stay away from me," he shouted, his eyes wild with fear. "I know what you're trying to do." Before we could respond, he ran back into his house, slamming the door behind him. We called the police, but when they arrived, Mr. Green refused to open the door. They eventually left, unable to do anything without a warrant. That night, Julia and I barely slept. We knew we had to do something, but we weren't sure what. The next morning, we decided to confront Mr. Green directly. We knocked on his door, but there was no answer. The house was eerily silent. We decided to enter, fearing for his safety and ours. Inside, the house was in disarray, with artwork and sculptures scattered everywhere. The air was thick with a musty, oppressive smell. We made our way to the basement, where we found Mr. Green in the hidden room, surrounded by the nightmarish artwork. He looked at us with a mixture of fear and desperation. "They won't let me go," he whispered. "The spirits, they want to keep me here." We tried to calm him down, but he became increasingly agitated. Suddenly, he lunged at us and a struggle ensued. In the chaos, Julia managed to hit him with a piece of wood, knocking him unconscious. We called the police, who arrived and took Mr. Green into custody. The authorities searched the house and discovered the hidden room and the disturbing evidence of Mr. Green's connection to Samuel Reed. It was revealed that Mr. Green was indeed a descendant of Reed and had been trying to recreate his ancestors' artwork and rituals, believing it would bring him fame and fortune. Mr. Green was taken to a psychiatric facility, and his house was sealed off as a crime scene. The media frenzy that followed brought the dark history of Samuel Reed back into the spotlight, and the community was left reeling from the revelations. Julia and I struggled to move on from the ordeal. The peaceful neighborhood we had once loved now felt tainted by the darkness we had uncovered. We eventually decided to sell our house and move to a different part of the city, hoping to find a fresh start once again. The experience left us more cautious and wary of the secrets that old houses and quiet neighbors might hold. We knew we would never forget the terror we had faced, and it made us appreciate the importance of trust and vigilance in our everyday lives. Story 3. When my wife Maria and I moved to Brooklyn, we were excited to start our new life. We had found a charming apartment in a bustling neighborhood, full of life and culture. I, Jason, was a 38-year-old software developer, and Maria was a freelance writer. We both loved the energy of the city and looked forward to exploring all it had to offer. Our neighbor, Mr. Black, was a quiet man who kept to himself. He lived alone in the apartment next to ours and rarely interacted with anyone. At first, we didn't think much of it. After all, New York was full of people who valued their privacy. A few months after we moved in, we started hearing about people in the neighborhood disappearing without a trace. It was unsettling, but we tried not to let it affect us. However, as the number of disappearances grew, we couldn't ignore it any longer. One evening, while watching the news, we saw a report about a woman who had gone missing from our building. Maria and I exchanged worried glances. We had seen her around but didn't know her well. The thought that someone we had seen just days ago could vanish was terrifying. I started noticing Mr. Black's odd behavior. He would leave his apartment late at night, carrying large bags, and return hours later. I couldn't help but feel uneasy about it. One night, curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to follow him. He led me to an abandoned warehouse a few blocks away. I watched from a distance as he disappeared inside, carrying one of the large bags. After a while, he emerged empty-handed and returned home. My mind raced with questions. What was he doing there? I couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Black was involved in the disappearances. I shared my suspicions with Maria, and we decided to investigate further. We started by looking into his background but found very little information. It was as if he had appeared out of nowhere. One night, while Mr. Black was out, I managed to pick the lock on his apartment door. Inside, I found a hidden room filled with disturbing evidence. Photos of the missing people, personal items, and a map with locations marked. My heart pounded as I realized the implications. I showed Maria the evidence and we decided to confront Mr. Black. The next day we waited for him to leave and followed him to the warehouse. This time we entered after him, determined to uncover the truth. Inside, we found a network of tunnels and rooms filled with more disturbing items. As we explored, we heard Mr. Black approaching. We hid and listened as he talked to someone on the phone discussing his collection. We waited until he left before calling the police. They arrived quickly and searched the warehouse, finding evidence that linked Mr. Black to the disappearances. He was arrested and the missing people were found in the tunnels, alive but traumatized. Mr. Black's arrest didn't bring immediate peace. He had accomplices who were still out there, and they knew we had been involved in his capture. Maria and I started receiving threatening messages, and we felt like we were being watched. We installed security cameras and took precautions, but the sense of danger never left us. One night, someone tried to break into our apartment. We managed to scare them off, but it was clear that we were not safe. Desperate to escape the threat, Maria and I decided to leave Brooklyn. We packed our belongings and moved to a different part of the city, hoping to start fresh once again. The experience had left us shaken, but we were determined to move on. We remained cautious and vigilant, always aware of our surroundings. The trauma of those months stayed with us, but we found solace in knowing that we had helped stop a dangerous man and save lives. Story 4. Moving to Asheville, North Carolina was a dream come true for me, Rachel, and my husband, Tom. We had always wanted to escape the hustle and bustle of city life and find a peaceful retreat in the countryside. Our new house was perfect, a charming old farmhouse surrounded by acres of lush forest. Our neighbor, Mr. Miller, lived in a rundown farmhouse a few acres away. He was a reclusive man who rarely came outside. When we did see him, he always had a sinister smile on his face that made me uneasy. From the moment we moved in, I started receiving anonymous letters. They were written in scrawled handwriting and contained vague warnings about Mr. Miller. At first, I dismissed them as pranks, but as the letters became more frequent and detailed, I started to worry. One night, while Tom was away on a business trip, I heard someone walking around outside. I peeked out the window and saw Mr. Miller standing near the edge of our property, watching the house. His presence sent chills down my spine. As the weeks went by, the incidents grew more unsettling. I found dead animals on our doorstep and objects in the house were moved or went missing. Tom was skeptical at first, but when he witnessed Mr. Miller watching us from his property, he started to believe me. We decided to do some research on Mr. Miller and discovered that he had lived in the area for decades. There were rumors of strange occurrences and unsolved murders linked to him, but nothing concrete. The local community seemed to have accepted him as a part of the landscape, albeit a disturbing one. Determined to uncover the truth, Tom and I began investigating the history of our house and Mr. Miller. We found old photos and documents in our attic that revealed a dark past. Previous occupants of our house had reported similar experiences, and some had even disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The more we uncovered, the more convinced we became that Mr. Miller was the Watcher, a figure who stalked and terrorized residents of the area. We realized that we were his latest targets. Mr. Miller's behavior became more aggressive. He would stand outside our house for hours, staring at us with that sinister smile. We found evidence that he had been inside our house, footprints, misplaced items, and more dead animals. Tom and I were terrified, but we refused to be driven out of our home. We installed security cameras and began documenting every incident, hoping to gather enough evidence to take to the police. One evening, Mrs. Whitaker, an elderly woman from the town, came to our door. She had heard about our troubles and wanted to help. She told us about her own experiences with Mr. Miller and how she believed he was responsible for the disappearance of her husband years ago. Mrs. Whitaker shared old newspaper clippings and personal notes, revealing a pattern of behavior that spanned decades. It became clear that Mr. Miller was a dangerous man, and we needed to act fast. Mr. Miller's attacks reached a breaking point when he tried to break into our house one night. We called the police, but he fled before they arrived. The officers took our concern seriously and promised to increase patrols in the area, but we knew we couldn't rely solely on the police. We decided to confront Mr. Miller ourselves, hoping to catch him in the act and gather irrefutable evidence. One night, we set a trap. Tom and I pretended to leave the house, but we stayed hidden inside with a camera ready. Sure enough, Mr. Miller approached the house, trying to break in. We caught everything on camera and managed to fend him off until the police arrived. Mr. Miller was arrested, and the evidence we provided led to his conviction. The community was shocked to learn the truth about the Watcher, and Mrs. Whitaker finally had closure about her husband's disappearance. Tom and I stayed in our house, determined to reclaim our peace. The experience had brought us closer together and taught us the importance of standing up to our fears. We installed additional security measures and continued to be vigilant, but we refused to let the past haunt us. We were grateful for the support of our community and the chance to move forward with our lives. Story 5. The Florida sun was relentless as I pulled into the driveway of my new home in Coral Springs. It was a charming two-story house, complete with a white picket fence and a neatly trimmed lawn. It was everything I had dreamed of when I decided to move down south for a fresh start. My name is Rachel, and at 34 I was ready to leave the cold New England winters behind. I had managed to snag a great job as a marketing manager for a tech company in nearby Fort Lauderdale, and this move was supposed to be the beginning of a new chapter in my life. As I unloaded the last of the boxes from my car, I couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement and optimism. The neighborhood was picturesque, filled with families and retirees. The streets were lined with palm trees, and everyone seemed to know each other. It was the perfect place to start anew. I was eager to settle in and meet my neighbors. That evening, as I unpacked boxes in my living room, there was a knock on the door. I opened it to find an older woman standing there with a plate of cookies. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she said with a warm smile. "I'm Susan from next door." "Hi, Susan, I'm Rachel. Thank you so much for the cookies." "Please come in," I replied, stepping aside to let her in. We chatted for a while, and Susan filled me in on the neighborhood gossip. She was friendly and talkative, and I appreciated the company. As she was leaving, she pointed to the house across the street. "You'll want to keep an eye on Mr. Parker," she said, lowering her voice. "He's a bit odd." I glanced across the street at the house she mentioned. It looked unremarkable, but Susan's tone made me curious. "What do you mean?" I asked. "He's lived there for years, but no one really knows him. He keeps to himself, and there have been some strange rumors about him," Susan said, her expression serious. I thanked Susan for the warning and walked her to the door. As I closed it behind her, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of curiosity about Mr. Parker. The next few days were a whirlwind of unpacking and settling into my new routine. I met a few more neighbors, all of whom seemed friendly and welcoming, but I couldn't shake the curiosity about Mr. Parker. I hadn't seen him yet, and his house remained dark and quiet. One evening, as I was taking out the trash, I finally saw him. He was an older man, probably in his late 60s, with graying hair and a stooped posture. He was standing on his porch, staring out at the street with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Hello," I called out, trying to be friendly. "I'm Rachel, your new neighbor." He turned to look at me, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Evening," he replied curtly before turning and going back inside. I stood there for a moment, feeling a bit taken aback. He didn't seem friendly, but he didn't seem particularly menacing either. Just odd, as Susan had said. As the days turned into weeks, I settled into my new life in Coral Springs. My job was going well, and I enjoyed the warm weather and the friendly community. But Mr. Parker continued to intrigue me. He was always alone, and I rarely saw him leave his house. It wasn't long before I started noticing strange things happening around my house. At first, they were small and easily dismissed. A garden tool would go missing, only to reappear a few days later. My trash cans were knocked over, but there was no sign of any animals. Then one night, I heard strange noises coming from outside. It was a soft scraping sound, like someone dragging something across the pavement. I got up and looked out the window, but I couldn't see anything in the darkness. The next morning, I found strange footprints in my garden. They were muddy and led from the sidewalk to my back door. I felt a chill run down my spine as I examined them. They didn't look like any animal prints I'd seen before. I decided to install some security cameras around my property. I wanted to know what was going on, and the thought of having some evidence made me feel a bit safer. A few nights later, I was reviewing the footage from the security cameras when I saw something that made my blood run cold. It was Mr. Parker. He was standing in my garden, staring at my house. He stayed there for a few minutes, just watching, before walking back across the street to his own house. I replayed the footage several times, trying to make sense of it. Why was he watching my house in the middle of the night? What did he want? I decided to confront him the next day. I waited until I saw him on his porch and walked across the street. "Mr. Parker, can I talk to you for a moment?" I called out as I approached. He looked at me with that same unreadable expression. "What is it?" he asked. "I noticed you were in my garden the other night," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is there something you need?" He stared at me for a long moment before replying, "Just making sure everything is all right. There have been some break-ins in the area." I didn't know what to say. His explanation didn't make sense, but I couldn't accuse him of anything without more evidence. "Thank you for your concern, but please stay off my property," I said firmly. He nodded and turned away without another word. I walked back to my house, feeling more uneasy than ever. A few days later, I found a letter in my mailbox. It was written in a shaky hand and addressed to me. I opened it and read the contents with growing unease. "Rachel, I know you've seen me watching. You need to be careful. There are things happening in this neighborhood that you don't understand. Trust no one. A friend." I had no idea who could have sent the letter, but it only added to my growing sense of paranoia. I showed it to Susan, hoping she might have some insight. "This is really strange," she said, frowning as she read the letter. "I've never seen anything like this before. Do you think it could be from Mr. Parker?" I asked. She shook her head. I don't know, he's strange, but I don't think he would do something like this. I didn't know what to believe. The letter could be a prank or it could be a genuine warning. Either way, I felt more on edge than ever. A few nights later, I was jolted awake by the sound of breaking glass. My heart pounded as I grabbed my phone and crept downstairs. I could hear someone moving around in the kitchen. I called 911 and waited in the hallway, trying to stay out of sight. The police arrived quickly, but by the time they got there, the intruder was gone. They found the kitchen window broken and a few items missing, but nothing too valuable. I was shaken but grateful that the police had arrived so quickly. As they took my statement, I couldn't help but wonder if the break-in was connected to the letter. The next day, I decided to take Susan's advice and installed a more advanced security system. I also started locking my bedroom door at night just in case. A week later, I was reviewing the security footage from the night of the break-in. I noticed something odd in the footage from the night before the break-in. Mr. Parker was in my garden again, but this time he was digging. I felt a chill run down my spine as I watched him. What was he doing? I decided to check the spot where he had been digging. The next morning, I went out to the garden and started digging in the same spot. After a few minutes, I found something buried in the dirt. It was a small metal box. I opened the box and found a collection of old photographs and letters. They were all addressed to Mr. Parker, and the letters were from his wife, who had apparently passed away years ago. The photos showed Mr. Parker and his wife in happier times, but there were also more recent photos of my house and me. I didn't know what to make of the discovery. Why was Mr. Parker burying these things in my garden? What did he want with me? I decided to confront Mr. Parker once and for all. I took the box and marched across the street to his house. I banged on the door until he answered. What is this? I demanded, holding up the box. He looked at the box and then back at me, his expression inscrutable. You shouldn't have found that, he said quietly. Why were you burying these things in my garden? What do you want from me? I asked, my voice rising with anger and fear. He sighed and stepped aside, gesturing for me to come in. Reluctantly, I followed him into the house. It was dark and musty, filled with old furniture and boxes. He led me to the living room and motioned for me to sit. I'm sorry if I frightened you, he said, sitting down across from me. I didn't know how else to keep you safe. Safe from what? I asked, confused. There are things happening in this neighborhood that you don't understand, he said. I've been trying to protect you. I didn't know what to say. His explanation made no sense, but he seemed genuinely concerned. I need you to trust me, he said, his eyes pleading. There are people watching you and they're dangerous. Over the next few days, Mr. Parker revealed more about his past and the strange happenings in the neighborhood. He told me that his wife had been involved in some shady dealings with dangerous people, and they had been watching him ever since her death. He believed that these people were now targeting me, and he had been trying to keep an eye on me to protect me. The break-in, the letters, and the strange noises were all connected to these people. I didn't know whether to believe him, but the evidence was starting to add up. I decided to take his warning seriously and started being more cautious. One night I heard noises outside again. This time I was prepared. I grabbed a baseball bat and crept downstairs. I could see shadows moving outside the window. I called Mr. Parker and he came over immediately. We both stood in the dark, waiting for the intruders to make their move. Suddenly the front door burst open and two men entered. Mr. Parker and I confronted them, and a struggle ensued. We managed to fend them off and call the police, who arrived quickly and arrested the intruders. The police questioned the men and discovered that they were indeed connected to Mr. Parker's wife's past dealings. They had been watching me, trying to intimidate me into leaving the neighborhood. After the arrests, things finally started to settle down. The neighborhood returned to its peaceful state, and I was able to sleep soundly again. I even started to develop a friendship with Mr. Parker, who turned out to be a kind and protective neighbor. We never talked much about the past, but I knew that we both had our own scars from the ordeal. I was grateful for his help and protection, and I knew that I wouldn't have been able to handle the situation without him. As the months passed, I settled back into my routine. My job was going well, and I made more friends in the neighborhood. I even started dating again, feeling more confident and secure in my new life. Mr. Parker and I remained close, and he continued to keep an eye out for any signs of trouble. The bond we had formed through our shared experience was unbreakable, and I knew that I could always count on him. I had learned a lot from the ordeal, including the importance of trusting my instincts and being cautious. But I also learned that sometimes the people we fear the most can turn out to be our greatest allies. Life in Coral Springs was finally what I had hoped it would be, and I was ready to embrace my new beginning with open arms.